Garrick had never been one to worry. Life in the Underhive demanded toughness, and he had learned to be clever, cautious, and quiet. But debts, he now realized, were different. They were alive. They waited. They hunted. What had seemed like a small favor had grown into a nightmare he could not escape. He had borrowed a sum from a man named Karen, a figure whose reputation was whispered like a curse. In the upper hive, such loans might be shrugged off, forgotten. In the Underhive, they were fatal. Karon's debts were never forgiven, and his collectors never slept. The streets of the lower hive reeked of rot, oil, and decay. Steam hissed from corroded pipes and mingled with the smell of refuse and stagnant water. Shadows clung to the walls, stretching unnaturally whenever Garrick passed, like fingers reaching to drag him into the darkness. The hum of machinery vibrated deep into his bones, a constant reminder that he was in a living, breathing labyrinth of metal and stone. Every footstep echoed far too loudly, bouncing through the tunnels as though the Underhive itself mocked him. He told himself he was imagining it, but a small, gnawing voice inside knew otherwise. It began with whispers, soft and almost imperceptible. At first, Garrick thought it was the wind through rusted vents, or the creaking of old metal settling after centuries of neglect. But the whispers grew clearer, sharper, as though the very walls were speaking to him. He heard his name, twisted and drawn out, and then words that chilled him to the bone. You owe, and we know. He spun, heart hammering, but there was nothing. Only the shadows and the hissing steam. His chest tightened as panic gnawed at him. He had heard the stories of those who fell behind on payments, those who vanished were never seen again. The Underhive did not simply forget a debt. It consumed it, devouring the debtor until nothing remained. By the time he reached his rented room, Garrick was shaking. The quarters were cramped and patched with tarps and sheets of rusted metal, a place that usually offered some semblance of safety. Tonight, it felt like a coffin. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every drip of water from the ceiling sounded like claws scraping against stone. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, twisting in corners, stretching when he tried to look away. Then he saw a scrap of paper on the table, pale and thin, stained darkly. His hands trembled as he picked it up. Scrawled in what looked like blood were the words, "Your time is up." The ink was warm to the touch, sticky, as if written moments before. But how could that be? He had been alone. A tapping started on the wall behind him, irregular, deliberate, like fingernails raking metal. He froze, every nerve screaming, heart hammering against his ribs. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only silence. He told himself it was a trick of the old building, the settling of metal and stone. But in the Underhive, even buildings could lie, and even walls could move. Something was coming for him, Garrick knew it, and no amount of self-reassurance would make it stop. The hours stretched into days, though time had little meaning in the twisting labyrinth beneath the hive. The Underhive's corridors seemed to shift and bend around him. Stairs he had passed moments ago now sagged and led into blackness he did not remember. Shadows gathered in corners, sometimes flickering just out of sight. A movement at the edge of his vision made him spin violently, but nothing was there. A child with hollow eyes had watched him once, whispering words he could not understand, before vanishing into a wall. A figure appeared briefly in an alleyway, long and thin, limbs bent at impossible angles, only to dissolve into smoke as he blinked. The debt was no longer a number in a ledger, it had become a living predator. The streets were alive with menace. The market seemed crowded, but no one met his eyes. Faces blurred under the dim flickering lights, expressions twisted and grotesque. Every shadow held a possibility of death. He tried to ask after Karen, to find someone who might know how to escape, but every word he spoke echoed in the tunnels as though the walls themselves mocked him. The Underhive was a maze of despair, and every path led back to him. He realized then that it was not just the collectors he had to fear. The Underhive itself was aware, bending and twisting to trap him, reshaping around his fear, whispering of death and oblivion at every turn. Exhaustion set in, but there was no rest. Every sleep brought nightmares worse than the tunnels themselves. In his dreams, he wandered endlessly through corridors that resembled, but were not, the Underhive he knew. The walls oozed and moved, dripping dark fluid that hissed when it touched the floor. Faces pressed through the metal and stone, distorted images of people he had once known. Mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Shadows whispered his name, calling him into corners he knew would lead only to pain. And always, in the background, was the sense of being hunted, of something patient and eternal, waiting for him to falter. Food and water became abstract concerns. Survival meant only moving, always moving, through the twisting, folding corridors. He began to see patterns where none should exist, shapes and figures lurking in reflections, catching movement in puddles of oily water. Machines and pipes groaned in symphony with the whispers, and the hum of the underhive became a constant, pulsing heartbeat. Garrick realized that the tunnels were not just stone and metal, they were a creature, feeding on fear, sustaining themselves on the terror of those foolish enough to owe. One night, or what felt like night, he stumbled into a room he did not recognize. Mirrors lined the walls. In them he saw himself, yet not himself. Reflections smiled when he did not, cried when he did not, bled from the eyes. One hand pressed through the glass, reaching for him. In a panic, he smashed the mirror, and for a horrifying moment, his own hand seemed fused to the shards, trembling as if possessed by something alien. He tore away, gasping, and the whispers laughed, echoing through the mirrored room, whispering promises of death and retribution. As he fled the mirrors, he began to notice other horrors. The underhive was alive with subtle, crawling things, glimpses of shapes darting in peripheral vision, vanishing before he could see them clearly. Pipes leaked acidic fluids, puddles that hissed when stepped in, and floors seemed to shift under his weight. Every corner could hide a predator, every shadow could conceal death. He learned to move quietly, though the echoes of his own footsteps betrayed him. He felt hunted, stalked not by one, but by countless unseen entities, all aware of his every move. He remembered the warning scrawled in blood, "Your time is up." It was not merely a threat, it was a promise. He could not pay it back in currency, in labor, or in lies. Only survival, and even that seemed impossible. Doors he had once trusted no longer led to safety. Stairs twisted into themselves, leading to voids where screams echoed. Steam vents hissed in synchrony with the whispers, and for every step he took forward, he felt pulled back, trapped in an infinite loop. The underhive fed on his fear, growing stronger with each panicked heartbeat. By the time Garrick reached what he thought was a safe corridor, he realized he was being followed. The sound was subtle, at first a scraping, faint and irregular, like claws over steel. He turned abruptly, heart hammering, but the tunnel was empty. And yet, the sensation of eyes on him, cold and calculating, would not leave. He ran blindly, slipping on wet patches, hearing laughter that came from the walls themselves. Every exit seemed blocked, and the walls, which he had thought permanent, now leaned and twisted, closing in on him, reshaping the path to ensure he could not escape. Sleep, food, even hope became meaningless. The underhive was patient, eternal. Garrick began to understand what it meant to owe something here. A debt was not a thing to be repaid. It was a sentence, a mark that could never be erased. And it had marked him. Shadows pressed closer. Figures moved just beyond recognition, and whispers never ceased. He realized with a growing horror that he was already a part of it, and yet he still had to run, still had to survive, knowing that the collector, or whatever force collected debts, was patient, eternal, and inevitable. Time blurred into an endless nightmare. Corridors folded into themselves, traps appeared where none should be, and every step carried the echo of countless screams. Walls pressed and whispered, machinery groaned like tortured beasts, and the floor seemed to pulse beneath him. Garrick had become a ghost among ghosts, haunted by a debt he could not understand, in a place that was alive with malice, and as he stumbled into yet another tunnel, breath ragged, vision swimming, he realized the most terrifying truth. The underhive did not forgive. It did not forget. Every shadow, every whisper, every shift of the walls was proof of that. Owing a debt here was not a mistake. It was a sentence that began the moment the words were written and ended only when the debtor was consumed. Garrick did not know how long he had been running, how many days had passed, but he knew one thing with certainty: the debt would never sleep. It would wait. And it would come for him, no matter how far he ran, no matter how deep he hid, until there was nothing left but fear and darkness. Garrick barely survived the first night. His lungs burned from running, his legs ached, and his mind teetered on the edge of collapse. He thought he might be safe, hidden in some forgotten corner of the lower hive, but the underhive does not forget. It remembers every debt, every misstep, every fear. He had run blindly, seeking refuge, but the shadows followed. Not like before, lingering in corners. This time, They moved with intent, converging toward him in ways the eye could barely register. It started as a sound, a scraping, faint, deliberate. At first, Garrick thought it was another trick of the twisting corridors, a loose pipe, a rat. Then he heard the rhythm, deliberate, methodical, like claws dragging across steel. He froze, trying to convince himself it was nothing, but the sound drew closer, echoing with a terrifying patience. Every instinct screamed that he was being hunted. From the shadows emerged a figure unlike any Garrick had seen. Its limbs were elongated, unnaturally bent, almost spider-like, and its body seemed stitched together from pieces that should never have coexisted. A rusted breathing mask covered its face, and beneath the visor, molten orange eyes glowed with hunger. It did not speak at first. It simply stood watching, as if studying him. Garrick's throat went dry. He tried to move, but his legs were heavy, leaden with fear. The figure tilted its head, as if amused, and in a voice like grinding metal and crushed bone, it whispered, "Debts must be paid, one way or another." Garrick stumbled backward, falling against the tunnel wall. Panic surged, and he tried to run, but the Underhive itself seemed to conspire against him. Corridors he had memorized twisted into impossible angles, stairwells disappeared, walls shifted, doors led nowhere. It was as if the tunnels themselves had become extensions of the Collector, guiding him, corralling him toward some inevitable fate. The figure did not chase him in the way a predator would. It did not need to. The corridors bent, the shadows moved. The machinery groaned in harmony with the Collector's presence. Garrick realized with a growing horror that this was not merely a being. It was an instrument of the Underhive itself. The walls, the pipes, the flickering lights, all were extensions of its will. Every corridor funneled him toward it, and yet he could not see how. He ran blindly, turning corner after corner, feeling the hot, metallic gaze of the Collector behind him. He stumbled into a room, hoping for a dead end that might give him a chance to hide. The walls were covered in old posters, faded propaganda, and the remnants of lives that had been erased. The Collector stepped closer, its mask hissing with each breath. The eyes, burning alive, seemed to pierce his very soul. Garrick realized that this being was not just collecting debts. It was collecting terror. Every shiver, every desperate heartbeat fed it, sustained it. The tunnel seemed to narrow, the ceiling pressing down, suffocating him. He turned a corner and found a puddle of oily water reflecting the flickering lights. In it, he saw not his own reflection but twisted visions of himself, hands elongated, mouth stretched in a silent scream, eyes hollow and lifeless. And in each reflection, the Collector loomed closer, always patient, always inevitable. Garrick understood that the creature did not need to touch him. Its presence alone could warp reality, bend perception, and drive a person to madness. Desperation overtook him. He dove into the twisting tunnels, following paths that led nowhere, ignoring the whispering voices echoing from the walls. Each step brought him closer to exhaustion, but the Collector never slowed. The scraping footsteps followed, then the grinding voice murmuring his name, mocking him. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You owe." Garrick's screams joined the chorus of echoes that filled the labyrinth, yet the creature remained silent, patient, omnipresent. At one point, he found himself in a chamber filled with rusted machinery. Pipes hissed, and the air smelled of burning oil and decay. The machinery seemed to shift subtly, wires twisting like serpents, pistons groaning like tortured screams. He tried to climb to the exit, but the stairs buckled under his weight, bending and stretching into impossible angles. The Collector watched, unhurried, waiting for him to make a mistake, and Garrick knew that a single misstep here would mean certain death, not just his life, but his soul. As he crawled through the chamber, he glimpsed other figures, shadows pressed against walls, faces peering through cracks in metal panels, eyes hollow and desperate. They whispered, but their words were drowned in the grinding hum of the Underhive. Were they the remnants of other debtors, victims of the Collector? Garrick could not tell. Fear blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Every tunnel, every shadow, every breath felt alive. He was no longer simply running. He was being drawn, manipulated by forces he could not comprehend. Hours, or was it days, passed though time seemed meaningless here. The walls shifted around him, the corridors bending like liquid, and the ground pulsed as if aware of his presence. The Collector did not speak. It did not need to. It was everywhere and nowhere. A presence so absolute that Garrick felt the very air tighten around him. He realized the true horror of Owing in the Underhive. The debt is not a thing to be repaid. It is a constant predator, a shadow that grows with each heartbeat, consuming sanity before life. He stumbled into a narrow tunnel, dimly lit by flickering lamps that cast grotesque shadows. For a moment, Garrick allowed himself a desperate thought. Maybe he could hide, maybe he could escape. But the shadows began to move differently now, sliding along walls and ceilings, converging like a tide. The machinery groaned louder, in rhythm with his own frantic heartbeat. And then he heard it, a grinding, metallic hiss, coming not from behind but from all around. The collector had surrounded him. Garrick's mind snapped. He turned blindly, hands clawing at the walls, but every exit seemed sealed by the presence of the creature. Shapes shifted in the periphery. Figures almost human but grotesquely elongated, their limbs bending in impossible ways. They whispered, laughed, and sometimes screamed in voices that seemed to echo from deep within him. The collector did not need to touch him. Its will bent reality itself. Exhaustion overtook him. He collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, mind fraying at the edges. The shadows pressed closer, the whispers grew louder, and the scraping of claws on metal became a rhythm, a heartbeat, a countdown. Garrick realized he could not outrun this. The Underhive itself had chosen him. The debt was alive, and the collector was patient. It would wait for him, it would haunt him, it would consume him entirely. And in that moment, Garrick understood the true meaning of Owing in the Underhive. No amount of cunning, no frantic running, no hiding could save him. The debt was eternal, and the collector would always arrive. It had come for him now, and it would not leave until it had taken everything: his body, his mind, and the fragile fragments of his soul that had survived the first night. He was trapped, hunted, and completely alone. And yet, somehow, he knew the terror had only just begun. Garrick ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled like broken machinery, but the tunnels never ended. Every turn led to another twist, another shadow, another whisper. The Underhive had become a living nightmare, its walls breathing, shifting, closing in and stretching out at the same time. Time had lost meaning. Hours, days, maybe weeks, he could not tell. The collector's presence lingered always, patient, inevitable, and omnipresent. The tunnels grew narrower, forcing him to squeeze through gaps where the walls pressed in uncomfortably. The smell of rot and oil was overpowering, filling his nostrils with decay so thick he gagged. Every footstep echoed off the walls, a chorus of haunting, mocking sounds that followed him, repeating and warping into laughter. He tried to focus, to find a safe path, but the walls themselves seemed alive, crawling with rust and grime, moving to mislead him, to trap him. Then he saw them, figures pressed into the walls themselves. Their faces were hollow-eyed, mouths open in silent screams, stretched unnaturally as if fused to the metal. Some reached out, clawed hands leaving deep scratches in the steel, their bodies barely human, twisted into grotesque shapes that shivered and writhed. Garrick wanted to turn and run, but the tunnel narrowed further, leaving him trapped with these horrors pressed on every side. They whispered his name in unison, their voices a choir of torment, and the echoes bounced endlessly, pressing into his skull. The air grew colder, and he realized he was shivering violently, teeth chattering uncontrollably. His vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, he could not tell if the faces in the walls were real or hallucinations. A thin stream of blood trickled from a crack in the ceiling, and when it dripped onto the floor, the puddle seemed to ripple as though alive, reflecting not his face, but that of someone, or something, watching him from beneath. He stumbled backward, tripping over broken pipes and debris, scraping his hands across rusted metal that cut him. The pain was sharp, real, grounding, but not enough to anchor him against the terror. A distant sound reached him, faint at first, like the shuffle of feet or claws, then closer, louder, echoing through the tunnels with inhuman precision. The collector. He knew it was near, observing him from just out of sight. Every instinct screamed to hide, but nowhere was safe. The tunnels twisted impossibly, exits appearing and vanishing as if the Underhive itself mocked him. Garrick understood then that the collector did not need to chase, it could bend the world around him, forcing him to run endlessly, while it loomed in every shadow, watching and waiting. He came to a junction where 3 tunnels converged, and he hesitated, chest heaving. From one, he heard faint whispers, like hundreds of voices murmuring secrets. Another was silent, but shadows moved inside it, creeping along walls like oil. The last tunnel was dark, so dark that it seemed to swallow the faint glow from the lamps. Every choice felt fatal. He stepped into the dark tunnel, praying it would lead somewhere safe, but the walls shifted, closing in, and the tunnel stretched impossibly long, swallowing him in darkness. Hours passed, or maybe seconds. It was impossible to tell. His mind began to fray, the whispers growing louder, repeating, mocking, echoing endlessly in his skull. He stumbled into a room that seemed impossibly large, its ceiling lost in darkness. The floor was slick with grime and oily water, and every step made him slip. Shapes moved just at the edge of vision, tall, thin, with limbs bending wrong, crawling along walls and ceilings. Their faces were hidden, but he could feel their gaze, their hunger. Desperation overtook him, and he pressed forward, ignoring the whispers that now felt like screaming. He began to see things that could not exist. A corridor filled with fire that burned without light. Walls made of human faces that screamed when touched, pipes that hissed and twitched as though crawling. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. The Underhive had stolen that from him too. The Collector's presence pressed down, not just on the tunnels, but on his mind, bending reality itself to drive him mad. Then he found the mirrors, dozens of them, lining a room too small to contain them. At first he thought they were safe, reflecting nothing but the flickering lamps. But then he saw his reflection wrong. His eyes were hollow, his mouth stretched into a grin he had never made. Behind him, shadows moved in the mirrors, twisting, reaching, pressing faces through the glass. He slammed his hands against a mirror, and the glass warped, bending like water. The reflection screamed in a soundless wail, and for a horrifying moment, Garrick's own hands seemed fused to the surface. He tore himself away, gasping, and stumbled into darkness. The whispers became words now, clear and menacing. "You cannot escape. You owe. We are patient. We are eternal." The voices seemed to come from every surface, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, even his own body. The tunnels themselves vibrated with the sound of grinding metal and whispers, pulsating as if alive. Every step Garrick took echoed endlessly, feeding the Underhive's hunger, reinforcing the Collector's presence. He tried to climb over a collapsed walkway, but the floor shifted beneath him, dropping him into a puddle of oily water. As he struggled to rise, he saw the shapes in the puddle twisted, skeletal forms with faces that grinned and eyes that glowed orange. They reached for him, crawling toward him, but when he flinched, they dissolved into mist. Reality bent around him, making him doubt everything: where the tunnels began, where they ended, what was real, what was imagined. Hours blurred into days. Hunger, exhaustion, fear, they were meaningless in the Underhive. All that mattered was movement, survival, and the knowledge that the Collector was always near, shaping the tunnels, twisting reality, and waiting for him to falter. Shadows clung to him, whispers followed him, and the very walls seemed to breathe, expand, and contract in response to his fear. Finally, he stumbled into a chamber that seemed impossibly quiet. The whispers had faded, replaced by a terrible anticipation. The walls were smooth metallic, reflecting a distorted image of himself. In the reflection, he saw the debt, not as numbers, not as words, but as a living thing, a dark, twisting shape with endless hunger, crawling closer, reaching through the mirrored surface, waiting to consume him. Garrick realized, with a bone-deep terror, that the debt would never rest. The Collector would never leave him, and the Underhive would never forgive. He sank to the floor, trembling, chest heaving, mind fraying. The tunnels outside seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The whispers returned, louder now, chanting his name, recounting his failures, reminding him of every choice that had brought him here. There was no escape, only the endless corridors, the creeping shadows, and the patient, inevitable Collector. Garrick understood that surviving meant nothing. The debt was eternal, and he had already failed. Even as he tried to stand, to move, to continue the endless flight, a cold presence brushed against him. Not touching, not speaking, just awareness. He shivered, realizing that the Collector was never far. The Underhive itself bent around him, shaping the tunnels, twisting reality, feeding on his terror. Each corridor, each shadow, each whispered word reinforced the inevitability. There was no escape. The debt would follow him, would haunt him, would consume him piece by piece. And Garrick knew that he was only at the beginning of this nightmare. The tunnels were endless, filled with horrors that would grow bolder as his fear deepened. The Collector would come again. Shadows would reach, walls would shift, whispers would scream. The Underhive was alive, and the price of owing was far beyond death. Garrick stumbled forward, lungs burning, legs trembling like broken pistons. The underhive seemed endless, folding over itself like some living, breathing nightmare. Every tunnel led to another, every shadow seemed to watch, every whisper drilled into his skull. The collector had vanished for a moment, or maybe he had only been too terrified to notice its presence, but Garrick could feel it everywhere. In the air, in the walls, in the very hum of machinery. The debt was alive, and it demanded more than gold or favors, it demanded everything. He found a chamber that seemed impossibly quiet. The faint glow of lamps flickered across walls of cold metal, making shadows twist in strange shapes. The air was thick with the smell of oil and decay, almost choking. His steps echoed unnaturally, bouncing off walls that seemed too far apart for the space he occupied. For a moment, Garrick thought he was alone. He dared to breathe. Then he saw the floor, ledger books, scores of them piled haphazardly, covered in grime and blood. Each page held a debt, crossed out in thick red ink, and each name was accompanied by a tally of failures, punishments, and disappearances. At the center of the pile, a single sheet fluttered, carried by a cold draft. He picked it up. His own name stared back at him. The debt was not a number, not a promise. It was a contract with the underhive itself, and the collector was the enforcer. Then he heard it, a whisper, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. "Choose your repayment." Garrick's heart sank. He spun, but the chamber seemed empty. Shadows gathered in the corners, moving like living things, coalescing into forms almost human but wrong in every way. Hollow eyes stared, mouths twisted in silent screams. They moved closer, waiting, patient, inevitable. He understood the choice now. The underhive did not simply punish. It demanded balance, a price that could never be ignored. He could offer himself completely, his mind, his body, his soul, or find some way to repay without surrendering entirely. But every choice carried consequences. The figures whispered, the ledger glowed faintly, and the chamber seemed to pulse with anticipation. Desperation overtook him. Garrick tried to flee, but the walls shifted, twisting into impossible angles. The exits he had hoped for were gone. Above him, pipes groaned, dripping dark liquid that hissed when it struck the floor. The shadows pressed closer, and now he could hear them whispering the names of all those who had failed before him. Each name was a warning, a promise, a death sentence fulfilled. The collector had come for them all, and Garrick realized he was next. He fell to his knees, tears mixing with grime. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion, they were meaningless now. All that mattered was the choice before him. The shadows pressed in, and from them emerged the faces of those he had seen in the upper hive. Friends, neighbors, strangers, all hollow-eyed, twisted, reminders of what became of those who failed. Their whispers pierced him. Choose, chooser, chooser. Garrick's mind raced. Could he surrender? Could he pay? And if he did, what would remain of him? The underhive demanded more than survival. It demanded obedience, sacrifice, and terror. One misstep, one hesitation, and the collector would claim him entirely. He knew it with a clarity that terrified him. There was no bargaining here. The debt could not be erased. It could not be cheated. Only payment or annihilation. He stood, trembling, and approached the ledger. His name glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Around him, shadows shifted, reaching, whispering. The very air felt alive, pressing against his skin. He traced a finger over the page, feeling the cold bite of metal embedded in the floor through the grime, the oppressive weight of judgment. Every debt recorded here had been paid in a different form, some with life, some with soul, some with madness. He realized with horror that the collector took not only what it demanded, but also what it desired: fear, suffering, and terror. A soft scrape sounded behind him, metal against metal. He turned but saw only shadows, thin and elongated, crawling along walls and ceiling. The whisper returned, louder now, more insistent: decide, or be decided. Garrick's stomach turned. His body screamed to run, but the tunnels had trapped him, folding around him, guiding him toward the final reckoning. Suddenly, the ledger lifted into the air, floating with an unseen force. Pages fluttered wildly, revealing images that burned into his mind, faces of debtors contorted in pain, limbs bent at impossible angles, eyes wide in terror, screams etched permanently into flesh. Garrick stumbled backward, heart pounding, aware that every glance into the pages strengthened the collector, feeding its power. The chamber grew darker, the shadows merging into a single amorphous mass, writhing and shifting, tendrils brushing his skin, whispering promises of suffering. Garrick sank to his knees again, realizing that the only way to survive was to confront the choice, to accept the price, whatever it might be. He clenched his fists, trembling, and forced himself to focus. There was no escaping the debt, only paying it, or being consumed entirely. As he raised his hands toward the ledger, a sudden flash of light illuminated the room, revealing the full horror around him. Figures pressed from the walls, faces hollow and screaming, eyes burning with hatred and despair. Some reached for him, others simply watched, waiting for him to falter. The shadows themselves writhed, twisting into grotesque shapes, coiling around him, whispering, testing his resolve. Garrick's mind threatened to shatter. He forced himself to breathe, slowly, painfully, as the air thickened with the presence of the collector. The whispers became voices he could understand, echoing memories he wished to forget. Failures, lies, betrayals, all counted against him. He realized that survival alone would not be enough. The Underhive demanded submission, a reckoning for the debt he had accrued. Every second spent hesitating strengthened the collector, and every heartbeat echoed his inescapable doom. Then he heard it, a voice, clear, cutting through the cacophony. Choose. It was neither human nor machine, neither living nor dead. It was the debt itself embodied, demanding resolution. Garrick understood that this moment was the true test. Surrender, and the collector would claim him fully, body and mind. Fight, and the Underhive itself would punish him in ways beyond comprehension. He dropped to the floor, pressing his hands to the ledger, feeling the cold bite of the pages and the weight of every soul recorded there. Fear threatened to paralyze him, but he forced himself to think, to act, to find a path that might let him survive without surrendering entirely. The shadows pressed closer, the tendrils of darkness brushing against his skin, whispering promises of pain. The walls themselves pulsed with expectation, waiting for his decision. And then, in a moment of clarity, Garrick made his choice. Not surrender, not escape, but payment in his own way. He drew on every ounce of cunning, every instinct honed in the Underhive, and whispered the words the ledger demanded. The shadows recoiled, the whispers faltered, and for the first time since the debt had haunted him, there was silence. The chamber felt impossibly still, as if the Underhive itself were holding its breath. Garrick collapsed, trembling, exhausted, aware that this reprieve was temporary. The collector had retreated for now, but the debt was not gone. It would wait, always, patiently, ready to return if he faltered again. The Underhive had shown him the true price of survival: fear, pain, and constant vigilance. The ledger had been satisfied, but only for a time. Garrick understood that owing in the Underhive was not about repayment, it was about endurance. He rose unsteadily, looking toward the twisting tunnels ahead. The shadows lingered, watching, waiting, whispering faintly, as if testing him still. The corridors stretched endlessly, each step a reminder that the Underhive never forgave, never forgot, and always demanded its due. Garrick moved forward, knowing that the true horror was not the collector alone, but the constant, oppressive reality of owing, surviving, and living under the ever-present threat of the Underhive itself. Even as he disappeared into the twisting maze, the whispers followed, faint and inevitable. "We will return. You owe. You will pay." Always, Garrick shivered, knowing that every step he took, every breath he drew, would be haunted by the price of survival. And in the darkness of the Underhive, he knew with certainty that the debt would never sleep. Garrick moved forward, each step heavier than the last. His body was battered, his mind frayed, but he had survived the collector's first judgment, or so he believed. The Underhive was quiet now, too quiet, and the silence pressed against him like a living thing. Shadows stretched in impossible angles, and the faint hum of machinery seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He could feel it, something lurking just beyond perception, watching, waiting. The debt was not done with him. It never would be. Hours, days, maybe weeks, time had no meaning here. Every corridor twisted and stretched, walls bending impossibly, ceilings sinking lower only to rise again. Floors shifted beneath his feet, puddles of black water reflecting faces that were not his own. Sometimes, in the corner of his vision, he caught glimpses of movement, figures crawling along walls, disappearing when he tried to focus. The Underhive was alive, and it had not forgotten him. Then came the whispers, soft at first, teasing, murmuring his name. He tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, harsher, filling his head with voices of those who had failed before him. "You cannot escape. You will pay, you will fall." Their chorus merged with the grinding of unseen machinery, the hiss of pipes, the creak of rusted metal, until every sound in the tunnels became a threat. Garrick's skin crawled, his teeth chattered, and he felt himself slipping, inch by inch, into madness. He stumbled into a cavern that seemed impossibly large. The walls were black metal, polished in some areas, rusted and oozing in others. Faint orange light flickered from cracks in the ceiling, casting grotesque shadows that moved independently of anything that could cast them. The air was thick, almost viscous, carrying the smell of burned oil and decay. It was here that he saw them, the victims, not bodies, not skeletons, but twisted, half-formed shapes pressed into the walls. Faces screamed silently, mouths stretched into impossible shapes, eyes hollow and desperate. They shifted slightly as he passed, watching him, waiting, whispering his name. And then he felt it, a cold touch on the back of his neck. Not fingers, not claws, but the undeniable pressure of something alive, something patient, observing. He spun, heart hammering, but there was nothing. Yet the sensation did not leave. The collector was near. He could feel it in every shadow, in every flicker of light, in every breath he drew. The chamber itself seemed to breathe. Walls pulsed, floors rippled, and the ceiling moaned as if alive. Shadows stretched toward him, reaching, coiling, waiting. The whispers became voices he could understand, accusations, demands, promises of pain. They told him what he already knew: the debt would never sleep, never rest, never forgive. Survival was a temporary reprieve, an illusion. Garrick stumbled forward, drawn deeper into the cavern. He passed reflections in pools of water that were not his own, showing visions of his failures, twisted and grotesque. His hands were clawed, his eyes hollow, his mouth frozen in a scream he could feel but could not hear. And behind him, in every reflection, the collector loomed closer, patient and eternal. He reached a narrow passage, one that seemed impossibly long. The walls bent inward, shadows crawling along the metal like living things. He heard a grinding sound, low and metallic, moving behind him. He could not run. Every step brought him closer to something inevitable, something unstoppable. The whispers became screams, echoing from all directions, filling his head with madness. Then he saw it, the ledger. It floated in the air, glowing faintly with an unholy light. Pages fluttered open, revealing his name, every failure, every lie, every misstep he had ever made. The collector had recorded it all, and now it demanded the final payment. Garrick fell to his knees, pressing hands to the pages, feeling the cold, biting energy radiating from the words. The debt was alive, it was watching, waiting, and it would claim him entirely. He screamed, and the tunnels screamed back. Shadows pressed in, tendrils of darkness brushing against him, whispering promises of torment. Faces pressed from the walls, mouths opening and closing, eyes glowing, all silent and horrifying. He tried to run, to move, but the floor shifted, twisting beneath his feet, and the ceiling pressed lower. Panic surged, consuming him. He was trapped completely and utterly in a nightmare that was not his imagination. The collector appeared, not as a figure but as a presence, massive and incomprehensible. The air grew colder, thicker, harder to breathe. The shadows coalesced into shapes that were almost human, almost alive, but twisted beyond recognition. They moved toward him, and the whispers turned to a single voice, cutting through the chaos. You owe, you will pay. Always. Garrick understood then the true horror of owing in the Underhive. It was not numbers, or currency, or even physical repayment. It was submission, fear, and endurance. The debt demanded life, mind, and soul. There was no escape, no hiding, no bargaining, only endurance, until the collector chose to take him fully, or until he failed and was erased entirely. He collapsed to the floor, trembling, eyes darting to every shadow, every movement, every reflection. The whispers merged into an unending chant, echoing in every corner of the cavern, following him, pressing into him, promising pain beyond imagining. Every instinct screamed that death was near, that surrender was inevitable, that the Underhive would never release him. And then the impossible happened. The chamber fell silent. The shadows froze. The whispers stopped. The ledger hovered just out of reach, its glow dimming. Garrick rose unsteadily, heart hammering, aware that this reprieve was temporary, fragile. The debt had paused, perhaps amused by his terror, perhaps testing his endurance. He understood with chilling clarity that survival here was not freedom. It was only preparation for the next torment, the next encounter, the next inevitable moment when the collector would return. He staggered through the tunnels, each step a reminder that the Underhive never forgave. Every corridor pulsed with life, every shadow waited, every whisper remembered. Garrick understood that the terror would follow him forever, an eternal echo of the debt he had incurred. It would linger in every dark corner, in every reflection, in every heartbeat. The collector would return, patient and inevitable, and he would never escape its gaze. And as he disappeared deeper into the twisting maze, Garrick knew one truth above all in the Underhive: owing is not a mistake. It is a sentence. A sentence that never ends, a debt that never sleeps, a predator that waits patiently for the next moment of weakness. The Underhive had claimed him, body and soul, and the eternal echo of the debt would follow him for the rest of his life, or what remained of it. Every shadow, every whisper, every shift of the walls reminded him the debt would return. The collector would wait, and in the darkness Garrick realized he would never be free.